and we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. William McCoy. I am the director of the Rutland Institute for Ethics here at Clemson University. I am so happy that each of you are joining us tonight, and I know there are some others that will join. I must apologize for having to make some last minute changes due to technical difficulties on our end. Next year, we will do all that we can to work through some of these difficulties and try not to have them affect our crowd. But I am so happy that those of you that are here, and I'm sure more will join as we go into our session. On tonight, well, let me just say this. The TIDE conference is for the spring semester of every academic year. The TIDE conference is the largest event that touches the most people through the Rutland Institute for Ethics. And as many of you know, and if you don't know, that our goal is to help our students to understand that number one, what ethical dilemmas are, and number two, to provide them with a framework and understanding of how to deal with ethical dilemmas that are presented in front of them and that they have to experience. Now, there are many ways that we do that. We have a lot of programming that we do. Our student group called Change does a wonderful job of programming. We also have a faculty group called FACE that is very involved in looking at curriculum and how we can integrate ethics education into curriculum across the campus. And then we do have a wonderful board of advisory board that supports us in many, many ways. And so tonight, I'm so happy that we're in our TIDE conference. This is the keynote session of the entire conference. And I am always extremely happy to be able to choose who's going to be involved in the keynote session, but also how the session will be set up. Because of some prior experiences, positive experiences, I wanted this year, which is our second year, to be a little bit more reflective of conversationalist methodology. And so the conference theme is using ethics and diversity to enhance critical thinking. And when I was sitting down trying to figure out how do we develop a keynote session around this, I wanted to involve some forward-thinking individuals and professionals that would help us get to the crux of that keynote title and our conference theme. So on tonight, I'm going to introduce you to our three panelists in just a quick moment. What I will ask all participants to do, if you would, is to mute yourselves. I'm perfectly fine if you want to put your picture up with that, but I would ask that everyone would mute. But we will have an opportunity throughout our session to ask questions if you so desire. You can also throw some questions in the chat and we will try our best to address those questions. So with us on tonight, I feel, as a friend of mine would say, giddy glad that the three panelists that we have joined us on tonight. First of all, none of this is in order of importance because all of them are important to me. But we have with us Dr. John Griffin. Dr. Griffin is the Senior Associate Provost here at Clemson University. And what makes him extra special to me is the fact that he is my boss. And when I was thinking about who in the world could I get to talk about critical thinking, his face immediately popped into my head as a person who lives, eats, sleeps, and breathes critical thinking and the perspectives of critical thinking. So thank you, John, tonight for joining us as a part of this panel. Then I have a very good friend who I've known probably for, oh goodness gracious, at least 10 plus years. She hails from University of Illinois, Champaign, Urbana-Champaign. I know there's a difference there. She is the executive director for the Center for Professional Responsibility in Business and Society. She is also a clinical assistant professor of business administration for the, is it Gies or Guys College of Business at the University of Illinois. Gies.
It's Gies.
Gies. Gies College of Business, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I was fortunate enough just to see her last week in Cincinnati, and we spent some quality time together for the first time in a number of years at a national conference that we both attended in Cincinnati, Ohio. So happy to have her here as the voice of ethics. And then, last but in no way least, we have with us DeVon Wilson. Now, the history of DeVon and I go back even further than Gretchen and I. As I think about it, DeVon and I have known each other for roughly 20 years. And we ended up working at the same college together, a small town in Wisconsin called Beloit College. And DeVon was directing some programs there. I know that there is a movie out that says something about white men can't jump or something like that. And every noonday, DeVon would play basketball. And when I went over to the gym and he asked me to join, I said, that's not me. So I must be a part of the movie somewhere. I can't jump. Basketball is not something that I do. And I think he invited me, John, one time. And after that, they never asked me to come back again because they understood I am horrible at basketball, just horrible. But DeVon and I go back a long way. I'm very familiar with his family, knew his child before she was even born. And so it is a pure delight to have DeVon here to talk to us from the perspective of diversity. DeVon is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And so without further ado, I'm going to allow them to do their own formal introduction. There's some parts that I probably missed, but if they would take the time to give their own formal introduction, and then we will begin to move directly into our panel discussion. Let's go ahead and start with John and then DeVon and Gretchen.
So what do I have, Bill? 25 minutes to introduce myself? No, I am so honored to be here for this session. You know, one thing Bill won't tell you is that he's a big reason that the Rutland Institute for Ethics has really grown and started to have a national as well as a campus presence. As he came in as director not too long ago and has really brought ethics to our campus here at Clemson. So this is an exciting session and a week of events that they've been putting on. I came to Clemson back in 2015, and as Bill said, I'm a scientist. I'm a neurophysiologist by training, so I think I have that critical eye on everything. But I love to see students learn to succeed, and I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight about critical thinking. I can't think of another time in our history where critical thinking and teaching our students to think critically is more important than right now. So I'm looking forward to engaging with the panel in this conversation.
Thank you, John. DeVon?
Yes, and first of all, it's a pleasure, and thank you for the invitation from Rutland Institute for Ethics, and my good friend Bill McCoy. We do go back a long ways, and it's just good that this is an important conversation. And really, thank you to Clemson University for sponsoring and having this kind of conversation, because it's at the heart of our work, and this is the kind of setting in which these conversations need to happen. And so I am thankful for being here. I also want to make sure that and in doing this, I have to acknowledge, that I am the grandson of Annie and John Kirkland from Timminsville, South Carolina. And so I have that connection to there, and cousin of LaVon Kirkland, who sits in the Ring of Honor over there in your stadium. And so I feel a connection to the Tigers down there in Clemson as well. But my commitment to this work has been from the days that Bill and I were working together at Beloit College, that these are critical questions as we think about what education means to being really the connective tissue for our society. Like ethics and critical thinking are a critical part of thinking about how do we advance our work and engage all members of our community in this important work. And so I look forward to this conversation because I think it's something that is missing. And this is the first step to moving, is creating space like this for us to dialogue and share and provide, information and create a space for advancing this work.
Very good. Thank you, DeVon. Gretchen?
Bill, thanks very much for the invitation to be here. I'm honored to be on this panel and delighted to be here with students from Clemson. Look forward to their questions, because I know you've carved out space later on for questions for the panel, and I think that will be great fun. So I am Gretchen Winter, as you mentioned. I'm a lawyer, and I am a professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I teach business ethics and professional responsibility to business majors, business minors, and to computer science students, as well as law students. The law students I teach are at Urbana-Champaign, and I also have a class that I teach to students in France. So we talk about ethics and compliance kind of nonstop in my life, and I find the subject to be fascinating and, frankly, never ending. So I look forward to the conversation tonight. As Bill mentioned, we were together recently. I serve as a member of the board of directors of the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics. And we did have our first live meeting in a couple of years, just a couple of weeks ago. And there is some joy, I must say, in getting together in person to explore the work that people have been doing in the ethics space over the time of COVID. Before I came to the University of Illinois 15 years ago, I was in business. I was the vice president of business practices, which is essentially the chief ethics and compliance officer for a company called Baxter International. Baxter is a global healthcare company. At the time, they had about 45,000 employees operating in 120 countries around the world. So I worked with employees all over the place in solving, addressing, and discussing their ethical questions. Prior to joining Baxter, I worked at a law firm where I worked on labor and employment matters. So a little bit of my background, Bill, and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gretchen. And that is a perfect segue into our first question, which will be for Gretchen. So Gretchen, what does or what should practical ethics look like in today's higher education environment?
Well, thanks for that question, Bill. And I love the term practical ethics, because I think that ethics as a concept needs to be turned into practical terms. Certainly, I saw that when I worked at Baxter. So the fundamental question I guess I'd ask is, what do you do? when you are confronted by a situation that challenges your personal values, your professional responsibilities, and or the values of your institution, whether that is Clemson or an organization for which you are working or volunteering. Challenges exist, ethical challenges exist at the individual and personal level, at work, school, in your family life. Those kinds of challenges exist at an organizational level as well, for companies, for governments, not-for-profits, and these organizations and your individual experiences all provide you with an opportunity to live out your values in a demonstrable way. So for me, that's what practical ethics really embraces. How do you give life to your values? How do you give meaning to the professional responsibility codes that may govern what you do? As a lawyer, there's certainly codes that govern what I'm supposed to do when confronted with a challenge. And when you start digging into those rules, what you often find out is that they're not crystal clear. There are a lot of gray areas, and the critical thinking that I know we're going to be talking about today is necessary for you to be able to analyze the rules that seemingly cover your situation, but can in fact be interpreted in a variety of ways. Let's talk about a couple of examples, perhaps some school examples. In preparation for this, actually, I picked this up at our API conference last week, right? I've got this little brochure. I don't know if you can really see it, but it's the Clemson Ethics, Rutland Institute for Ethics brochure. And what I loved was the cover. It says, "Aspire to tiger integrity. Live ethically, lead with confidence, and achieve success." A statement of the values that Clemson holds. And it starts with this notion of integrity and the notion of living ethically. That's the first statement for a reason. It's the base of both confidence and success. So when you face challenges in class, practical ethics challenges in class, you have a chance to cheat on an exam, to borrow assignment answers from a friend because you didn't have time to complete your assignment. Borrowing a computer because yours broke down, and seeing somebody else's assignment and really liking the way that they did it. These are challenges in a classroom that some of you may have faced or some of your friends may have faced. You have challenges as a participant in registered student organizations, as a leader or as a participant, as you're managing costs or expenses, when you might need or want to cut corners in a planning process, or you might respond to pressure from the leadership of an RSO, for example. As you search for jobs and you write your resume, there are fundamental practical ethics challenges. My son is a junior in college, and I just revised his resume this weekend, and I spent a lot of time asking him the same questions I'm going to pose to you right now. What does it really mean to be proficient in Spanish? If somebody started speaking to you in Spanish and continuing the interview in Spanish, how would you do? He took it off his resume, right? Wasn't going to succeed. I teach computer science students as well. I think I mentioned that a moment ago. The number of languages these computer science students put on their resume is never ending. It's a gigantic list. Sometimes it's just a list of languages that they've learned because they took a class their first year, freshman year, first semester, and they've never used that computer language again. So I posed the same question or similar question to them. If during an interview, the interviewer said, "Write me code in this language," would you be able to do it? Or would you say, "Oh, I have to go back and learn it"? If you say that you're proficient in something on your resume, if you want to puff up what your accomplishments are on your resume, think twice. Think about this, live ethically and aspiring to tiger integrity. These challenges continue if you're an intern. Often you're faced with the kinds of challenges new employees would face, and you're not quite sure what to do. What about submitting hours, submitting expenses, or taking on assignments that seem a little bit uncertain to you or don't sound quite right to you. We had a student who was asked to misrepresent herself as part of an assignment to conduct competitive intelligence inquiries. She did it, but it didn't work out so well for her. So she didn't feel comfortable about it, but she did it anyway because of authority pressure. And unfortunately, was not offered a job at the end of the summer. So these kinds of challenges happen in daily life for you today. They will also present themselves as practical opportunities to exercise your values and give life to your professional responsibilities in whatever field you choose. Bill, does that help a little bit explain and take a look at what practical ethics might mean?
Actually, Gretchen, I think you did a fantastic job of relating and making ethics relatable to students at their level and bringing about some examples that are very common in higher education that students will face. So thank you very much for approaching that particular subject. DeVon, if you would provide our audience with 3 to 5 major diversity and equity challenges facing universities in general in higher education.
Thank you for the question. And I think in some ways, Gretchen set this up in a way, probably not even expecting to set it up this way, but I think it kind of helped. And normally I would approach this question in a different way, but given the framework we're using tonight, I'm going to take a chance. I think this is really important when you think about critical thinking, and sometimes you have to take a chance and think about how you might want to approach something. But I think one of the fundamental challenges for institutions today is the ability to live their institutional truth and their mission, despite their history. It really pushes against a number of frameworks around when we think about the kinds of ethical dilemmas that come up. And particularly in a time when we have students who are asking really fundamental questions around accountability. And I think this at the framework and mission level is a challenge. And this is just a fundamental challenge of higher education, but I think it gets amplified as we think about issues of diversity and equity, and even thinking about inclusion. The other thing I think is really important in terms of how we respond to these challenges is around real change versus performative activism, right? And that is where you really start to get into issues of ethics, issues of thinking of critical thinking, when you are looking for the types of solutions that are institutional in terms of transformation, rather than the kinds of solutions that just respond to a demand without any kind of idea around sustainability, right? And I think those are real critical things, and institutions have struggled with what that means, especially as we've been trying to navigate a pandemic. We've been trying to navigate really important issues related to social justice. And in a way that in some ways our students have developed a capacity that exceeds our faculty and staff. They come, they come with this sense of justice and fundamental value we want to really couple in how we think about how ethics lives and how critical thinking lives in ways that we're not used to. And I also think that the challenge is thinking about this from not a fixed mindset. Institutions have a culture that is built in a historical context that Carol Dweck would talk to you in terms of from a psychological standpoint, but I think from an organizational science standpoint is important when we're thinking about it. And so rather than being fixed, thinking about solutions as being innovative. And I think that's where critical thinking is important, because critical thinking leads to innovation. Diversity and equity inclusion are very important innovation tools, right? And so I think to really think about what those kind of real approaches can be and how we might think outside of our normal ways of thinking. How does that fit in terms of thinking about the contribution from the humanities? You know, we become so STEM focused in way, but how do we tap into the humanities and arts? I heard Cornel West talk about this and talking about ethics and talking about the way in which music and others have contributed to really helping us understand this intersection and answers and ways in which we come to meaning. But I think the most fundamental thing, and I think Gretchen hit a little bit on this, is our ability to understand the difference between education and school. Because of the commodification and the way we've structured things in terms of how we set up the educational experience, and particularly with undergraduate education, it's become more about commodification of education, right? It's become more about what contributes to the input, the throughput, the output. What is about the net tuition than what it is and how are we meeting the needs of consumers rather than what are happening to particularly our students in the most critical part of their development, right? This is the opportunity where they are exploring so many important questions and in having moral formation. How are we creating these really important questions in the sense that students are asking about? Like if you ever spend time with students in informal spaces and where they can just kind of let go, they are getting into these conversations, but we have not created a way in which we can engage some of these things in our formal way. And so when we ask these questions around ethics and critical thinking, are we creating a space that creates the kind of deep learning that needs to happen? That forces you to ask these equity-minded questions that are, I think, coupled and central to how we think about ethics, right? And are we doing that in terms of what it means to be excellent? So when we talk about the Wisconsin experience, the fundamental question I ask is who gets and who doesn't? When we talk about the Wisconsin idea, when we talk about the impact in terms of what happens with the state, the region, and the world, which I think is one of the greatest frameworks I've ever really come across. Can we really be saying we're doing that when we think about what's happening in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? Bill, you understand what I'm talking about, right? And so it becomes an ethical dilemma in terms of what we put out in the public versus what we actually do. Are we adhering to our values? And where this is critical is our students know, our graduate students know. The groups that ask the biggest questions and really raise these up in ways that sometimes throw faculty and staff off are these two groups. They are fundamentally asking these questions. And our inability to lean into them versus leaning away is going to be critical to our long-term success as institutions, right? And at this point, a lot of institutions haven't seen that as a core part of what it means to be an excellent higher ed institution. Some are coming that way. They're making strides, but not all institutions have really embodied that. And you can't really get to those real core opportunities without thinking about looking through that lens, kind of ethical lens, and using a critical, using kind of a critical thinking framework where you're asking really important questions, but you're not afraid. Right? You're not afraid of the answers. You understand that this is a process in the journey.
So all of this is really good and forcing us to think about things a little bit outside of the box in terms of how we approach how we represent ourselves as schools. So with that in mind, let's go back to Becca's question, because I think it resonates with us. I'm going to ask both DeVon and Gretchen to, if they want to join, get in on this. And then I'm going to ask John to segue it, the question. In other words, answer the question, and then I'll give him the next question. But Becca's asked, what kinds of ethical dilemmas should we as students expect to face as young professionals? And how can we combat them or even use them to help develop our professional character. And I think that really goes to the essence of what both Gretchen and DeVon have been talking about. So Gretchen, if you could talk a little bit about that, DeVon, if you so desire, and then John, if you would address it, then we'll go right into the next question.
That's great. Great question. Thanks, Becca. And I'm so glad that you asked that, because it gives me a chance to, again, show you this book that looks like it's got a really fuzzy title. It's called The Young Professional's Survival Guide, From Cab Fares to Moral Snares. This book is written by a colleague of mine, C.K. Gonzalez, that's Gunsalus. She and I taught a class together for our first-year students in the College of Business. I call this book her love letter to Business 101, because it captures so many examples of the kinds of things students face when they get out into the real world. It is sprinkled with literally hundreds of examples of the kinds of scenarios that our students have faced and brought back to us, both after they graduate with an undergraduate degree, and some who have been in the real world and returned for their master's degrees, and they say, well, here's what happened. So there are a lot of real examples here with specific ways to address them. Your point on using these situations to develop your professional character is right on the money. And I hope that you pick up a copy of the book online or from the library and really delve into some of these scenarios. I use the book in my classes because the examples are so real. I also give this as a present to all my all the children of my friends who graduate from college and say, you need this book. And they come back to me, many of them have come back to me later to say, this was one of the most important books I read, because it gave me some ideas about the kinds of things I might face. And if my stomach is telling me it's not quite right, it's probably not. And I've got some ideas about how to address them. So that's my short answer to your question.
DeVon, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is so I've had a number of conversations about kind of the generational pressures that are happening within organizations because of the kind of values that young professionals are bringing. Young professionals, there's growing research around it's important that their companies stand for something. And so I think some of the ethical dilemmas that young professionals face is when the reality of where the company is from a value standpoint isn't aligning with what they believe they want to be able to commit to. And where it becomes an opportunity is for you to think about, from where you sit, how do you help to bring it into alignment? And it becomes a part of building that in terms of, and it is not moving away from your values, but part of it is, how do you bring people into the conversation? How do you understand ways in which you can engage in folks with real conversations that link to the mission of the organization that you are working with? So a lot of times, I had I was working with a student, and this was actually a graduate student, which was a really interesting thing. And I saw the email he was about to send to the chairs of the department. I mean, the most dynamic, well thought out in terms of breaking down a number of elements of equity and inclusion, and had all the right framing. But it wasn't the kind of thing that was going to bring folks into the conversation. And so I think a lot of times for young professionals, it's really important for you to scan. It's important for even within organizations to find mentors who in ways share what you're thinking and can help you think about it. One of the things that I learned early on is that you can lead from wherever you sit, but you have to think about how it moves the overall mission. And you don't have to sacrifice who you are in terms of your professional character to help an organization get there. And I think that's really important early on. A lot of it where I see this happening is where there appears to be misalignment between values. And part of it is understanding how you can lead and be an agent of change in a way that can positively impact the organization.
Thank you, DeVon. And John, I'd like you to address that question. And in addition to addressing that question, if you would also address what does it mean, and I think they kind of fold into each other, what does it mean to think critically in the college setting, and are we doing it right?
Yeah, well, thanks, Bill. And this has been a great discussion, and I think we could all come up with lots of different scenarios and dilemmas. And I think the place I sit on this panel is being one of those who, when I think of our students at Clemson, how do you develop the ability to have those conversations? How do you develop the values to bring in, and as DeVon said, lead from wherever you sit in the room? I think our Clemson students are very lucky that we have Bill and the Rutland Institute for Ethics. At the same time, we have an institute every summer that talks about critical thinking and works with our faculty to infuse it into our classroom. And our local expert, David Knox, I asked him, I said, you know, you can go on the internet and you can find 1,000 different definitions of what is critical thinking. And we have the privilege just about every year of having David Fascione, an expert critical thinking, come and talk to our faculty, our graduate students. And just to give a definition, to read from Dr. Fascione's definition, that it is a process of purposeful, reflective judgment that manifests itself in giving reasoned and fair-minded consideration to evidence, concepts, methods, and contexts or standards that allows you to decide what you believe and what you do. And I think this is a great process to think about when you're talking about our students, especially in today's world. The challenges are immense. I'm thinking about what's out there, thinking about what is the COVID virus, what are vaccines and their purposes, what's going on in the world right now, and forming a reflective opinion that you can bring to a conversation. And as an educator, this is the part of what I believe in what we can do with our students to build that ability, that process. Because for many students, this is a scary thing when you come to college. There is nothing more fearful than a professor saying, well, there's no right answer to that question. What do they mean? I need to know the answer so I can get it right on the exam. But what the faculty we're training to do is to say to students, there are facts, and then there's a building process to get to be critically coming to what you believe and what you're going to do about it. And I think that's where these two environments, when you talk about ethics and diversity and inclusion and community, come together with this process of helping our students learn how to take that cultural shift from what's on the exam to, I want to build an opinion that I can step back and critically think about information, consider what is known, and have my own conclusion that I can bring to the table. And actually, as DeVon said, have that conversation, because I have developed it, not just because somebody told me, but because I now have formed my own opinion based on what I know and what is known. And I think that's a great part about higher ed, and the shift I'm seeing, and something that we really value at Clemson, is that engaged learning. Sounds like both Gretchen and DeVon do this in their class. They don't just go to the chalkboard and write. They sit there and pose a scenario and get our students to think, because that's what we want to see. That's the citizen we want to create, that engaged learning piece of forming a conclusion from a hypothesis, bringing our scholarship into our classrooms. We want that, because to accept without critical thought means that you're accepting sometimes false premises, and you're not building new knowledge. As educators, it's a shift for us too. And that's why we have our institute every summer at Clemson, so that we can be more intentional across the disciplines of bringing critical thinking into the classroom. And David's Summer Institute has had over 300 faculty and graduate students from across the country, not just at Clemson, come and change over 700 courses. The last thing I'll say, because I want to make sure we open up for discussion, is that, as DeVon said, and Gretchen has talked about, when you think about a liberal arts education, There are two big things that I see you want to develop: critical thinkers and creative thinkers. If a student comes out of college and is able to think critically and can be creative, as DeVon said, that's an innovator. That's somebody I want on my team. And when you talk to employers, they say three things to us all the time. Communication skills, absolutely. We want a good communicator. Ethical values, absolutely. We want somebody who's ethical. And now somebody who can think across community and diversity. And you put critical thinking on that, now you've got the trifecta. That's somebody I want on my team, no matter what it is I'm hiring you for, no matter where you are in your career. That kind of person is the person we want to see come through our colleges and graduate and go out there and have these conversations that we're having today. So that's why I'm excited to be here. There's some great questions popping up in the chat, so I'm going to keep myself short.
That is great. I mean, all of this is melding very well with the questions that our students are asking. So let's just take a moment to, first of all, thank you, Becca, for your question. And then let's go to Lori. Lori has asked, as a subordinate employee, how would you address the actions of your superior if they are clearly being unethical and not following the company's mission? More so, what would you do if they expected you to follow suit? And Gretchen, would you take a stab at that? And then DeVon and John.
Happy to do so. And Lori, I'm smiling when I smiled when I saw your question, because it's so sensible and it ties back to the practical ethics definition I was providing earlier. It ties back to the Young Professionals Survival Guide. More importantly, though, it calls on my experience as an ethics officer for a large multinational company. I conducted new employee orientation training, and I would say to every new employee who walked in the door, we hope everything happens here in exactly the way that you want it to happen. Sadly, that doesn't always happen. So we have 10 ways that you can raise issues within the company to get your concerns addressed. And then I would outline all of the ways that employees could raise questions, talk to managers, talk to experts. If the question was a legal question, go to the law department. A finance question, go to the finance department. If you don't get an answer that you like, or that you don't understand, or that you still think is wrong, we have other options for you. And one of those is coming to the ethics office, coming to see someone like me as the chief ethics officer, who exists solely to help employees who are troubled by something that they're being asked to do. And I had employees from all over the world, from every part of our company, come to see me to talk about things that troubled them. And then we work together to find a way to address those issues. So one option in the situation you describe is to find a supervisor, find an expert, find an ethics officer. And most large companies have ethics offices for the express purpose of helping you address these issues. Go raise the issue, because companies want to solve these problems as much as you do. So that's certainly one thing I think you can do. A second thing that I would suggest is that you develop a set of decision-making frameworks that you incorporate into your everyday life. Build your professional responsibility muscle, create decision-making, good decision-making as a habit. I love this STAR model that Clemson has, along with the ethical tests. Using that STAR decision-making model in your classes, in your extracurricular activities, and at your work will help you figure out, one, how to frame the issue, and two, where to take it if you are in fact at work. This STAR decision-making model doesn't just exist for the purposes of using it at Clemson or in a class. It's something that you can incorporate into your thinking process and take into your work life. Finally, let me suggest that you develop what we call personal scripts. There are preemptive scripts and reactive scripts. So if you are asked to do something that makes you uncomfortable, and you have to react in a fairly short period of time, you should have a couple of short sentences already in your mind that you have used before. Wow, I need to think about that. Can I get back to you in 20 minutes before we take the next step on this project? To buy yourself a little time to figure out what you want to do in that particular scenario. I am personally quite fond of the opening phrase, please help me understand. And that often works and doesn't offend. By the way, if you have an ethical problem with the supervisor, we still want you to have a job afterwards, right? Even if you have to raise and challenge someone in a position of authority. So what's the personal script you're going to use to open the conversation and to assume that perhaps there's something you don't understand about what you're being asked to do? So could you please help me understand why we're choosing to do X this way? Or what you're talking about seems somewhat inconsistent with the training I got during orientation. Perhaps I misunderstood. Could you help me understand how this really works here? So I think having a decision-making framework that you've incorporated into your life, asking questions, finding the right people within the company to ask questions to about the situation you've encountered, and using personal scripts to have a conversation with the supervisor or with somebody else who's in the work group, I think are all ways that you can address that particular challenge. Thanks for raising the question, Lori.
Very good. DeVon, anything you wanted to add to that?
I would just say to students, Gretchen just gave you some incredible nuggets. One of the things I always tell my students, know when you are hearing some nuggets. If there's staff on and faculty, those are incredible nuggets. And that question is really an appreciative inquiry framework. And I think it's really important way to look at it. And sometimes we are assuming that everybody understands the rules and the policy. So to me, and what I want to tell folks up front, and folks who work at universities, understand that nobody really understands the policies. One of the things I had to tell my staff early on is most universities, organizations work on the telephone game. So there's sometimes a telephone, like by the time you get to the third, fourth person, the message changes. And so if you understand that most organizations have that dysfunction, it helps you frame a lot of what Gretchen is talking about. And it also allows you to do something what I think is really important is give folks grace, right? We never know what somebody's going through. So when the framework that Gretchen is using allows you to get a better understanding without making an assumption, which is critical if we're going to create space for change and innovation, and it demonstrates leadership. So if you sit down, a lot of times I will look at the policy. Because I grew up in higher education running federal programs where you had to really understand and you had to really be in conversation sometimes with government officials who thought they could tell you what to do. And sometimes they didn't read the policy. And so part of what you needed to do is really be clear. And then you can get in with the policy in hand to say, help me understand why we're choosing this direction versus this direction. I just want to understand because maybe something I missed. Right, so you give them opportunities, and sometimes when they read it, they're like, I didn't realize that was a policy, right? So what happened is you done built yourself up for a battle that didn't even necessarily have to happen. And what has happened 9 times out of 10 times, I am discovering something they didn't realize even changed, been updated, or whatever. And so I think part of it is really try to make sure there's clear alignment, and that you're staying true to the mission, and you're just checking in because things might have changed, right? People may not have communicated the change. And so I think really kind of checking your assumptions is really important before you get into that space, because there's always an assumption that everybody's paying attention to the rules, especially if someone worked in higher education. Some of the people you think should know the rules don't necessarily know the rules. Right? They have not read them closely.
Thank you, DeVon. John, you wanted to jump in on this?
Well, then we come right back to that process. How do you think? How do you get to your conclusion? How do you just think, hey, wait a minute, I question what's happening here in this scenario or this situation, and then be able to talk about it. And that's one of the things that I believe is that when you form an opinion or you form a plan that's gone through that process of critical thinking, you brought in your ethical values and your community values, youth walk into that conversation in a very strong, rational, logical way versus the emotion that can make those situations just elevate to a point where nothing's being understood on either side, that we don't understand the rules and nobody wants to take the time to actually understand the rules. So for me, that skill of building that ability to critically think and bringing values in allows you to engage in those conversations in a way that actually may create change. And I think that's an important piece.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I encourage the students to continue dropping questions into the chat, but we do have a couple of questions. I'm going to go a slight bit out of order from what I've given our panelists. I'm going to drop down to what we have as question 6. And the question is, because I think this is really important for us to address for our students and any faculty that are on in this meeting. What instructional methods should faculty utilize to enhance the critical thinking skills of their students? What instructional methods should faculty utilize to enhance the critical thinking skills of their students? We'll go with DeVon first, then John, then Gretchen.
You know, I think this is a great place to introduce some of the pedagogy we learned from intercultural dialogues or diversity dialogues in ways in which we are being very intentional. I think John laid out some really important ways in how we think about kind of the critical thinking. And I think these are spaces that allow for students to get into, that promote reflection and promote active listening, right? Think about that. And I also think that it's important to build in opportunities for students to take a deeper dive. I often like to think about research in ways that students have to really think about what people are saying out there using an evidence-based approach, and then coming back into space where they can begin to present that information. One of the best things I love doing is poster presentations, because you can do these mini poster presentations, and what it does is hones your skills to be able to get your elevator talk, to really hone in on those important points. And it creates a space for a dialogue where people are rotating. One of the things that we do in our Center for Academic Excellence is we have a symposium where students articulate the essential learning outcomes of the institution, and they are poster presentations in ways they're articulating what they have gotten out of their liberal arts education. And it's a great space in which they can really start to, in their own words, kind of shape and think about what their Wisconsin experience has been all about. It's like one of the most powerful, you know, how many people actually understand the essential learning outcomes? How many students actually have to talk about them, and to have these students in here articulating it? And so creating moments like that where there's reflection, opportunities for students to share out in their own way and in dialogue with folks in space that allows for them to kind of ebb and flow and think and draw and learn, I think are really important parts. And you can do this in large lecture courses. You can do this in small seminars. You can really, and it sounds like Clemson is doing a lot of this, but I think having some of those fundamental opportunities and understanding that this is a developmental process. So these kind of warm-up activities, a lot of times I have faculty come to me and talk about ways in which they've done group dynamics, they've done group activities, but they haven't prepared the groups. They haven't prepared the groups to understand some of these things we understand about the research. And so you end up having, even in these spaces, sometimes, particularly in predominantly white institutions, students of color are feeling isolated because of the way the activity got set up. So when you think about the learning activity, you got to think about everyone involved and how they're able to engage. But if you can do some of these really powerful things that we've learned from intercultural dialogue, has a really good framework around some of the ways in which they do, where there's some active listening. I think you can get some deeper learning. We have to get to this place where students go a little bit deeper. They get beyond the surface, right? And if you can create those kind of spaces, those are the kind of experiences that when students reflect, they often share out about. Those are the ones that they talk about, that they remember. Some of the other things they don't, but those kind of experiences in my experience, students will talk about those as meaningful experiences. They will remember those faculty members or instructors because they were allowed to kind of have that kind of personalized, deep experience, whether it's in science, technology, or it's humanities. I think those are really important ways to think about it as well. And faculty, not being fearful to try something new. And I love it. I love when I see faculty members trying something new and letting students know you're trying it, right? So that they understand that you are making yourself vulnerable.
Well, I think DeVon's right on. I mean, that the shift in a student when they come as freshmen, many times, that fear that culture you develop in high school where you don't raise your hand unless you know the right answer. And that's the only time. And you get into a dialogue, and I'm not going to speak up because I'm not sure of my opinion, or I don't know if my opinion will be accepted. To create a culture, a dialogue, a place of reflection where I don't have to have the answer at the beginning of the conversation. And in the end, I'm forming it, and I'm actually creating new knowledge as I have that participation. That's what engaged learning should be across the disciplines, that forming of new information. And that is so important to everyone's ability to grow and to succeed. And one case for me, as that's, in my own research, I'm a neurophysiologist, I'm not an ethicist, but I had a problem and I couldn't figure it out. And I had a bunch of students and they saw me struggling. And one day they showed up at my office door with a whiteboard. I still don't ever ask what wall they took it off of, but they had a discussion and they came down and said, Dr. Griffin, we think we have the solution. They did. We got a patent and a cover in a major science journal because of this methodology that they thought out of the box for. That to me is what critical thinking should be. It is discovery of new knowledge. And when you can bring your values into those conversations and your ability to let everybody participate, and your opinions grow as you're participating, you're forming your own new knowledge. That's the exciting thing about higher education that we have to keep building. That's what it should be. Facts are there, and yes, you need to know them, but that's not the end point anymore.
I am so jazzed. DeVon, I want to come to Wisconsin for the poster presentation. I live in Chicago. It's not that far. Invite me. That'll be great. And John, this critical thinking seminar that you've got, I would drive to Clemson for that. So invite me too. I'd love to be there.
Bill will take you to lunch.
Okay, that sounds good. From my point of view, I think one of the things that can be done by faculty in every discipline is to actually make use of a tool that you already have publicized throughout the campus through the Rutland Institute, and that's the STAR decision-making model that we mentioned before. Every discipline has an ethical dilemma of some kind or another. Every situation that you might encounter has an ethical dimension. How do you recognize it? What do you do about it? And how do you develop the options for addressing it? And John, to your point, let's be creative and think about other ways to solve problems. It seems to me that there's one core question that we use in our decision-making model at Illinois that students often have trouble with, and that's this: what are the options? It's easy to say, yes, I'll do what the boss wants. No, I won't do what the boss wants. Okay, that's two. And now you have to find more, because there's always space in between yes and no to come up with some creative ways to address what you believe to be the core ethical problem. And that skill doesn't just arrive overnight. It's a product of ongoing critical thinking, John, as you've described, and DeVon trying to incorporate all of the things that you've been talking about. It's part of that. If every faculty member used or asked students to use the STAR decision-making framework as part of the normal course of problem solving, problem analysis within a particular course, as you looked at the ethical dilemmas of a particular issue. And I'm not saying it's happened every day, every hour, every situation, but to incorporate that into the class, you give all of Clemson the common language, the common framework to begin to think about, talk about, and make discussion of ethical problems a normal part of what happens on a campus. It's not just faculty, though. It seems to me that RAs can use this in dorm life. Student leaders can use this with RSOs. Faculty advisors can use that as they advise students on extracurricular activities. So I think identifying, as you have, a common decision-making framework, and then seeing that pop up in different places across the campus will reinforce the message and give students the ability to, what do I want to think? Oh yeah, right. To make ethical decisions as easily as they cheer for the Tigers on a Saturday football game, right? Okay. So that's, I think, something that could be used as well. Hope that helps.
Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you, Lori, for though that particular question. And I think for your question, I'm sorry. And then our panelists I really thought it was important for us to think through instructional methodologies as we're framing this for our students. And to that end, I want to ask, it looks like we have time for about one more, maybe two more questions. But the conference theme is using ethics and diversity to enhance critical thinking. So my question to each of you is, how can we use ethics and diversity to enhance critical thinking? How can we use ethics and diversity to enhance critical thinking? I'll ask DeVon to approach that, and then followed by John, and then Gretchen.
And so what I might substitute on diversity is I would think about equity. And I think if we strive for equity minded, it forces, ethics is about asking questions. And I think the dilemmas, if you use an equity lens, forces you, if you use the equity lens, you start to identify ethical dilemmas, right? And so, like, I believe that, University of Southern California Center for Urban Education has what they call the equity-minded indicators. Really important questions that you have to ask. And it gets back to one of the things I said early on when I was talking about my work when I first got to Wisconsin, about the Wisconsin experience and what we value. And I asked the fundamental question, who gets it, who doesn't? I think when you start to look at things through an equity lens as part of it, I think you start to get more synergy around this, in a sense. And so I think that's a critical, because it forces you to ask important questions. And I think that is where ethics lives in terms of understanding your values, your morals, and what you say you stand for, what you're all about. But I also think that's where critical thinking comes in, because it forces you to struggle and work through it in ways that is designed to find those solutions, right? And when I see that Clemson talks about this idea of family, which I love, right? But what does that mean? What are we living if there are family members who are hurting, right? If there are faculty who are feeling alienated, if there are staff folks who are struggling, what does that mean? And how are we really living our truth, right? And I think when you look at it through an equity lens, I think that you start to get to some really critical ways to get at the solutions. You start to frame it in a way that can bring people into the conversation. That's critical. And I think the last point of this is, as you do that, you have to have an onboarding. I think part of the discourse and the struggle that happens around a lot of this work is that we assume that everybody can go 0 to 100. And one of the things that's sometimes difficult for students who come with so much capacity around some of this work in a lot of different ways that they might even identify, is that in some ways, sometimes they're more advanced in some of these spaces that push us in ways that we're not. And so how as a community, as a family, how do you allow people to onboard into the conversation? Because this is lifelong endeavor, right? This is a lifelong endeavor. And so, you know, do we have onboarding strategies, right? Do we have something called forgiveness and grace, right? All of these things play critical roles in our ability to advance this work as we think about it around, you frame it as ethics and diversity, but I really think it's really that intersection between ethics and equity, which is different, because that allows for us to really say, are we all here able to live that same truth? Are we all here able to live it in a way that we've articulated? If not, how do we get there? How do we get there, right? And it really changes the conversation. So that's just some general thoughts. I'll be able to jump back in if you need me, but you know, I thought that I would probably take it in that direction.
Oh, I love what DeVon has said. I remember the first time I met Lee Gill, who we hired at Clemson as our chief diversity officer, and Lee said to me, "You don't change somebody's long-held opinion in one event or one conversation, because you have to bring that critical thinking to the conversation, that lens, bringing those lenses." And again, that definition I gave at that beginning, critical thinking is the process of purposeful reflection and judgment to figure out what you believe and then what you're going to do. And that's not an easy process. It's much easier to have somebody tell me what I should believe. Or as Gretchen said, there's two answers, yes or no. Well, no, there aren't. But to get to that process sometimes can be very painful if we've grown up or in our own culture have an opinion that maybe we've never put critical thinking to. And now we're challenging those beliefs. And I think that's part of becoming a young adult. It's part of coming to college, and it's part of what we should be doing in education across, not just in the classroom, but as DeVon said, in that conversation about what is our community and are we accepting of everybody? I mean, this last week, you know, reaching out to our students from Ukraine and Russia and saying, we care about you both. This is not about you. And bringing them into the family has been very important here at Clemson. I'm sure it has at every campus, because that's what we should be doing. But those conversations, thinking about how you bring critical thinking to the process, those lenses, as DeVon put them, what is your ethical lens? What is your community lens? How do you bring them into your own conversation so that when you have your opinion, you can hold it strong and really have a good conversation and take the embattledness out of it? And I think that's an important thing that we're trying to get to in our process.
Oh, I love what both of you have said. And so let me just add a couple of thoughts to this wonderful conversation. The first is this notion of learning as a lifelong endeavor, critical thinking as a lifelong endeavor. You don't learn how to think about things or change your ideas overnight. It's true. And so I think one of the habits we all ought to build is the ability and the habit of challenging ourselves on a regular basis to engage in things that we know nothing about, right? Or know little about. So it might be books that you read, it might be museums that you go to, it might be going to a place of worship that you have never gone to before, to see and learn something different. And I think that opens your mind in ways that perhaps it hasn't been opened before. If you make that a habit, you'll be in a habit of lifelong learning and consistently being able to challenge some of your most cherished beliefs. John, you talk about what happens in college, and you hope that it happens for students. It happened for me in my first honors English class, first semester in college, and we read something that challenged my very, very, very fundamental beliefs about my religion. And it was groundbreaking, earth-shattering, and so disturbing. Yet it was a tremendous opportunity for me to examine what it was that I thought I always believed and to decide whether I still believed those things. That's what higher education is supposed to be, and I hope that everybody has an experience like that. The other thing I just want to mention, and you talked about equity and why it should be used as a concept instead of diversity, DeVon, and I love that concept. One of the fundamental problems with so many of these words that we choose to use, and I saw this in corporate America with great frequency, is that we use big words and we don't define them consistently throughout an organization. I say this all the time. What you call it matters. What you define something as being for the purposes of your organization matters, because you're explaining how an organization ought to understand the words that you've chosen to use, whether it's the Wisconsin idea, DeVon, that you were talking about, or the notion of diversity within a company. At Baxter, I say we, I haven't been there for 15 years. I still say we. Oh my gosh, pretty crazy. So we talked about diversity a lot, and people would say, oh, I'm all about diversity because we have people from different countries who sit on our senior management team. So we have people from different ethnic backgrounds and people who are from different countries. Therefore, we've checked the diversity box. Well, okay, in their minds, they're done. Is that what the company means when it talks about diversity? If you don't define it, you don't know. So whether you're talking about age or disability or race or ethnicity or language capability or any of the other many, many, many dimensions of diversity, I think definition is important. Once you define, you need some focus for your organization along with action steps that can be measured. Otherwise, we're just having a conversation, and a conversation's useful. A conversation should translate into some form of action that achieves some level of result. Thanks for the question, Bill.
Well, I am just overjoyed with how our session has gone. I am convinced that I chose the right three people who have just really given a lot of insight on all of the perspectives, whether it's diversity and/or equity, and equity mindedness, critical thinking, looking at things through an ethical lens. I think it's important for our students and any students to really be able to hone in their skills on the various things that occur in their lives to be able to make this meaningful to them at their very basic level, which is, just being able to identify what needs to happen in their own personal life. Thank you again, Dr. Griffin, and to DeVon, to Gretchen, for taking your time to be with our Clemson students